God can't hear you winning. It's a terrible thing, and I don't wish it on anybody. People create their own hell by rejecting their own highest level of identity.
Reality has its own identity, one that exists independently of our perception. And when we speak of reality, we are acknowledging its inherent nature.
If we're talking about a theory of everything, the first question we have to establish, does God exist?
Yes.
Simple as
Yes.
that.
Well, it's the identity has the reality has an identity. Okay? The identity is that as which something exists. Okay? Matter of fact, when you say the word reality, you're naming an identity. You're identifying something. This.
Our inability to fully know the historical figure of Jesus is due to the limitations of historical methodology, which prevents us from verifying everything written about him in the Bible.
Who is or was Jesus?
Jesus. We cannot possibly know what Jesus was because historical methodology prevents us from validating everything that is written of him in the Bible.
Hell, in a spiritual sense, may be understood as the loss of one's identity, a process of unbinding and destruction, as it is deemed unacceptable in the eyes of God.
Hell is simply the process of ceasing to exist, of being telecally unbound and having your identity destroyed, because it is unacceptable to God. See, God, in the CTME, there's something called the stratified identity. And God can be defined as the highest level of the stratified identity, the level that we all share with each other. We're all united in God. But God is good, and he must exclude evil in order to preserve the integrity of his identity. This is what he does. So if you deny God and you you're cutting your line of communication with God because you hate him so badly, then God can no longer see you, no longer wants to see you, and can no longer accept you into himself because he's totally consistent. God is totally, completely self-consistent and will not tolerate his denial.
Once someone denies the existence of God, it becomes a long and challenging journey to reconnect with him, requiring the removal of the spiritual barriers that were created.
The problem, however, is that once you've professed atheism, now you've got to get God's attention again. Okay? Once you've severed your soul, once you've put a cut in your soul and you've actually cut God off, now you've got to heal that severance before God can see you again. It takes a long time. It's not going to have, oh, well, I've changed my mind. I've decided not to hate God anymore. That's not good enough. Okay, it needs to go on for a long, long time, and you've really got to try and you've got to cry like a babe in the woods until God finally hears you. God is his own boundary. God is his own boundary. He's his own origin and his own boundary. And both of those things are distributed. This is part of the logical structure of the CTMD. Okay, both of those things are distributed everywhere because God is self-composed. He consists of himself everywhere. He is unbounded. Therefore, reality itself is unbounded in every part. That's why we have free will, among other things, among the properties of God. But we know what Jesus is now. Jesus is the ideal of human perfection. Someone who is willing to lay down everything and sacrifice himself for mankind. All right, that's what Jesus is. He is the image of human perfection. It is through a Jesus-shaped gateway that we can approach God. All right, we have to become perfect in order to unify with the perfection of God. So that's the way Jesus functions in the Christian religion, and the way he can function in every religion, because Jesus is our very few and far between, if you know what I mean. In Buddhism, of course, Buddhism has another central figure who is Buddha, or Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha. He's basically another kind of cat entirely. He didn't talk much about God, right? You can sort of infer a conscious higher reality from some of the things that Buddha said, but he didn't actually acknowledge the existence of God. He was also a rich individual that was born into privilege, and then, went around traveling and meditating and ministering to the masses and so forth.
Jesus' life defies many expectations. He was born in poverty and without advantages, which challenges conventional ideas about success and greatness.
But in several ways, he doesn't quite measure up to the image of Jesus. Jesus was born poor. He didn't start out with any advantages at all. He lived like a normal man, like an ordinary human being, absorbing the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune at every turn, which is what we have to do. That's what we're expected to do. Therefore, Jesus is an exemplar for us. Whereas Buddha, technically, is an exemplar to people who are born with privilege and then want to withdraw from reality and have a meditative existence and, never mention God. So there's a little bit of a difference between the two. Now, in the CTMU, we don't discriminate against Buddha because he lacks Jesus-like characteristics. Instead, we recognize him for his strengths, what he was, which is considerable. Buddha is not a lightweight in terms of religious figures. So he doesn't suffer at all for his non-resemblance to Jesus. But if we want the ideal of human perfection, that's Jesus. Just not something that God can afford to tolerate, because something that is perfect cannot tolerate, cannot absorb or assimilate imperfection into himself. He can tolerate it for a while, but then after a while, he's got to exclude it. All right, so this is what hell is. Basically, your own highest level of identity is telling you you can no longer exist because you're no longer in touch with me. You've cut your own identity in half. You've severed it. It's called the soul, the human soul. That's what these levels of stratified identity are. They're your soul, and once you interdict that, once you sever it, okay, you're cut off from God. That way, your own highest level of identity cannot communicate with you anymore. It can't see you. So when you beg on the bed, please take me back in, God can't hear you anymore. That's a terrible thing, and I don't wish it on anybody.
Understanding the concept of identity and the nature of God can prevent people from engaging in self-destructive behaviors as they begin to realize the importance of spiritual integrity.
But if people understand this, and they understand the stratified identity, and they understand what God is, namely their own highest level of identity, they won't punish themselves with unbinding and destruction. Now, because that's a very unpleasant experience, everybody wants to cling to their identity in the end. It's hellish. People create their own hell by rejecting their own highest level of identity.
That's what the CTMU says. It just comes up with the mathematical structure that you need to build a reality out of that. You see? So you come up with that identity, and then you search it for its properties. You see, once you've built the preliminary framework, then you start deducing the properties of this identity, and you find out that those properties match those of God as described in most of the world's major religions. Right?
Just the theistic religions? I'm thinking Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or are you talking also of, say...
Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Vedism. Of course, Hinduism and Vedism, they have a God. Taoism, their central principle is the way, or the Tao, okay? And they don't see Tao as God.
Yep.
And then in Buddhism, of course, you've got, they are trying basically to achieve sunyata, or emptiness, right? Which is, a lot of Buddhists don't even understand what that's supposed to mean. But once again, there's no God there. You can kind of read God implicitly. Some Buddhists, I've talked to Buddhists who actually think that there is a God in Buddhism of a sort. But it's, that concept of pure consciousness is what it is, okay? And if you ask them, well, whose consciousness are you talking about? They will point at themselves and say, my consciousness. In a way, they kind of attribute the existence of everything to themselves.
Across different cultures and philosophies, we find a common thread. Everyone encounters the fundamental principle of the Tao, or the way reality functions.
But anyway, when you look at what they've all got, you come down to the same thing. All right, everybody has the Tao, or the way. That's the way reality works, right? And everybody, has sunyata, which is pure syntax, right? Pure cognition with no instantiation, no content, right? And then you've got what the Abrahamic religions call God. It's all the same thing, okay? But what are its properties? Okay, are its properties such that you can deny the existence of God, or are its properties such that God definitely has to exist? And the answer is, God exists.
God definitely has
Properties of the central substance and central principle of reality, those properties are attributed to God, including, of course, things like you have the three O's: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, but then you've also got consciousness. God has to be sentient.
So we're not just defining God out of existence. Sometimes you'll hear people say God exists, but they'll give God such a weak and shallow definition that the God that they're describing has no relation to the God that we conceive of. You're saying, no, this God is God himself is conscious and therefore personal?
Yes, you can establish a personal relationship with God. We're images of God. You know what an image is? It's basically the product of a mapping. God maps himself into each human being.
If Christ says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, is he describing Satan here, or he's describing Lucifer? Or both?
If Christ were here and I could hear his exact words, I could perfectly interpret them.
Right, okay. Yeah.
But it's very hard to do that, 2,000 years after the fact, right? With all the different translations and interpretations that the Bible has undergone, okay?
And
so what I like to do is I like to approach it from first principles and look at it logically, right? Rationally. And what does logic tell us, if anything?
Logically, God requires a form of negation to fully manifest, but this negation is too complex and incoherent to operate in the world without human beings.
Well, logic tells us that basically God needs a negation, but that negation is too incoherent to function in this world except through human beings.
Right.
What's the rest of it? What's the rest of it all about?
Yeah.
And Lucifer is a concept that is better suited than Satan to that purpose.
When you think of when you take the suffering out of it, and you just think of people committing any particular sin, it just doesn't make any sense, does it? Or you think
the sense that it makes to them is they're enjoying it. They're hedonistically deriving pleasure from the sin. And of course, we all, have the same pleasure mechanisms.
Yeah.
So we're all tempted to commit sin, but we've got to keep a lid on it. There have to be limits. Okay? And what I'm worried about is that now Satan controls the world, and there are certain people involved in running things who don't have those limits.
Well,
they're so rich, they're so, powerful, that they don't need those limits anymore. So they've more or less thrown them off.
Now, there's nothing new to the idea that Satan or Lucifer, or let's call him just the old devil himself, is the prince of this world, and that the rich and the powerful they do his bidding, and they're bad people, and they follow their lowest appetites and their pleasures, and they can be sadistic. And so that's been going on for a long time. Is there something particular about the moment we're living in that says it's actually gotten much worse?
Yes, that is, we've had so many technological advancements that now the technology of surveillance and coercion are such, and these people are so rich, they're like black holes gravitating all the money to themselves, that they're unstoppable, okay? And because they're unstoppable, because they actually run everything, okay, we are endangered by them now.
Atheists, by focusing solely on the physical body, limit their sense of identity, severing themselves from their highest potential and spiritual understanding.
Let's take a quote from someone who criticized you, who said, if someone denies the existence of God, then God will exclude them from reality. And then this person said, well, okay, how does Langan explain the continued existence of militant atheists like Richard Dawkins?
Well, they have a physical body. They're basically cohering to their physical body, and that's what's providing them with a continued identity. They've reduced themselves, however, to pure physicality. There's not much left of them. They've actually cut off their highest level of identity, and that will affect them when they are retracted from the mortal plane, and you no longer have a body here that holds them together. Then that's it for them. Richie Dawkins will create his own kind of hell. All right? Because he will create his own kind of hell, and that is probably going to be a hell where nobody pays any attention to him. Okay? He's no longer a big shot at Oxford University. He can no longer run around telling people how much he hates God. Nobody wants to listen to him. That's what will happen to Richie. That's his hell. And then finally, in the end, he'll just be melted down to nothingness. And the telesis of which he consists will be redistributed to the rest of the universe.
You mentioned God can't absorb what's imperfect because God is perfect and he needs to stay consistent. However, none of us, at least I'm not perfect, and no one that I've met is perfect. So does that mean that none of us are going to heaven? None of us will be ultimately reabsorbed back into unbounded telesis?
The world throws too much at you for you to be perfect. Okay? Nobody can be perfect in this world. To live in the physical world is to be assaulted by imperfection all the time. Things that don't suit you and cause you to react sometimes poorly.
It is an oxymoron to think that God would hold grudges against us. Survival often requires difficult choices, and God's love does not condemn us for doing what we must to live.
And so it's an oxymoron to think that God holds this against you. We all have to adapt. We all have to do what it takes to survive, and God doesn't hate us for that. All right? He doesn't. That isn't what makes a person evil. What makes a person evil is total denial and negation of ultimate reality and his own highest level of identity, which is God. All right? It's wanting to undo, to unbind reality, to say the name of reality backwards. That's what evil is. And that's what you get punished for. And that's unfortunately what a lot of these new atheists are doing.
The world is globalistic now. It's run by globalists. That's their goal. I mean, that's what global means. We're going global. You know,
It's oligarchic.
Huh?
And it would therefore be oligarchic. What you're describing.
That's absolutely correct. Oligarchic, because very few of them actually exist.
And this is beyond, a U.S. senator. This is beyond the structures.
Those are puppets. You know, it's fairly common knowledge now, I suppose, that I regard most politicians as being one step removed from prostitutes. Right?
That's been true for
and that's not
the
that's
two
not
oldest
universal.
professions.
There are, a few exceptions, but let me tell you, they're on the run.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very serious situation, right? And if you take a look at these globalists, the ones that have thrown off all the limits, and they're fantastically rich and powerful now, and you take a look at what they actually have upstairs, I'm afraid it's not very impressive.
Right.
Okay? I mean, if you really look at their intellectual production, Soros might be the best of them.
Yeah.
He's at least got a theory of economics, and it's flawed, but, he at least has that. The rest of them are just a bunch of Sybarites.
While we experience and interact with the physical universe, it's important to recognize that God transcends this realm and is not confined to the material world around us.
The idea is that you've got the physical universe that you see around you, but God is not confined to the physical universe.
Okay.
See, there's an ordinary pantheist assumes that God is somehow confined to the universe, that there is just what we see around us and God is in every piece of it. God is distributed over.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit more complex than that, because this part of the universe that we see around us cannot exist just by itself.
Yeah.
Okay? There are certain things that it entails. And when you go into those entailments, that's how you get to God. That's how you get to the identity of reality. Okay? And now to get back to the reality of self-simulation, or at least that's what I call it, self-simulation. But to get back to the simulation hypothesis, that we're living in the display of that simulation. In addition to the display, there is also a processing aspect. Okay? And God, it captures both of those things. It captures both the display and the processing.
What do you mean? I hate to put it in.
Well, I mean, okay, here's the display. You realize the display contains states.
Yeah.
Okay, you see things, the objects contain states. States are static.
Yeah.
That's why they're called states.
Yeah.
Okay, static. How do they change? Well, they have to be processed. Something has to be processed.
Yeah.
And in the calculus, for example, those are tiny little infinitesimal intervals. Okay, but they are not actually contained in the states themselves. They have a neighborhood, a little tangent space or what have you, where you can sort of draw little vectors that suggest that some kind of processing is going on. But the idea of being a state and being a process, those are two different things.
Yeah.
In the ordinary way of looking at it, okay? It turns out that you can't properly describe reality and causation at all unless you put those things together somehow. And that's what it takes God to do. Okay? God provides the processing functionality for your state. You have an internal state, an external state. You're a material human being, right? Like to explain how that is changing through time, and maintaining its coherence through time, even as it changes. That's what you need God for.